Imagine a life without division. Without division. Without division. Without divisions.
Welcome to today's Without Division podcast. So today we are going to jump into identity. We're going to talk about freedom from identity. In particular, we'll go over a little bit of my life story, just a tiny bit, just enough to warrant the defragmentation of the self. So as always, I like to start with meditation. So let's just sit for 1 minute before we begin. And what I usually like to do is kind of set this intention to be here, to soak it in, to be present for what we dislike, for what we like, and know that nothing I'm saying is unique, or even should be treasured in any way. And anything that comes from this is really due to you and your internalizing of what's being said. Your particular predicament really has nothing to do with me. So let's begin. So let's get into it. So we have to ask ourselves the questions: why do we identify, and what do we get from it? So first, setting up the question reasonably, what is identification? Identification is usually a set of attributes that we give ourselves. So when I ask you, who are you? Or it's nice to meet you, tell me a little bit about yourself. A lot of times what we do is we go through a template of what we think we feel is most significant in us. Sometimes we're just parroting it back and we really don't mean anything other than the social template. But a lot of times what we'll find packed in there is this idea of ourself. And there, for example, we could think that I'm a boy, or I'm a girl, or I'm a man, or I'm a woman, or I'm white, or I'm black, or I'm Indian, or I'm from the US, or I'm an American, I'm an Englishman, and so on and so on. I'm Chinese, I'm fat, I'm slim, I'm tall, I'm smart, I'm clever. All of those identifications. And then we have the negation of identifications, which is I'm not creative, I'm not black, I'm not Chinese, I'm not like those people, I'm not like skilled, or I'm not dumb, I'm not. All of these identifications, these attributes, these propositional statements about ourselves. And you might wonder, well, what's wrong with this? Isn't it true that we are these things and that we are not other things? And so this kind of brings in my kind of background story. So I've identified for a big part of my life as an orphan, as in the foster care system, moving from home to home, all these different families of all these different origins, and all of these different identities that they had. I've lived with, if we take it just by what they identified with ethnically or culturally, I've lived in a Filipino family, a Mexican family, a British Irish family, a British family, a African American family, a Indian family, an Indian family. I think of those other ones. Well, those are the main ones, and I think that is enough points of diversity. And they were all on different scales of how much wealth they had, what type of jobs, positions, with a nuclear family, all sorts of ways I could slice them and identify them. But what I can tell you is each of them were separately identified with different things. And what I noticed was, as I moved from home to home, I tried to adapt to their identities, their formalities. And you might mistake that as like a cultural thing. But the reason why it's not cultural is actually very individualistic, because all of these individuals are dynamically interacting, and whose behaviors I'm like copying, it's a mix in where those come from. But the idea is each family I lived in had this idea of what it meant to be a Mexican, or whatever it is they identified with, what it was to be a woman, what it was to be a man, and then would project some of those identities onto me. And so there's the projecting onto other people, which you are trying to basically collapse an individual into something predictable, and also hold up your own moral standards through that. But you're also, what I also noticed, one thing that I would always do, I was considerably for some time, and this was on and off, I didn't speak as much to other people or out loud. I spoke a lot of times quite softly, mumbling, and I recall people telling me that I do more observing than I do talking. And so what I can say is, as I was observing these families, while I was also trying to learn how to belong, I would notice contradictions within the family and between families. And these contradictions would be contradictions of their identity. So they would say, well, women should do this, and women should do that, and not do that. And then also at the same time, be contradicting that with their behavior. And not only contradicting it, but then imposing the lines that they set up to their daughters. Right? So if the mother said, well, this is what it means to be a woman, she would then contradict it. But she would still try to instill it, and then it led to hiding that behavior and saying, well, they don't have to see that part, and I don't want them to think this and that. And so the idea that that woman or that person should be scrutinized under the lens of her being a woman is extremely limiting, when in fact she is really, if you observe anyone for long enough, what you'll see is we are full of contradictions. We are always changing. We have habitual patterns, but we also have variance that's happening all the time. And so you could imagine that our identifications, we're trying to identify, like we really think that a lot of identities, a lot of certain types of identities, dimensions of which to try to box an individual, are more important than others. So this person who I called my foster mom at the time really had this strong identity women, about what it means to be a woman. And she thought that I really was crossing the border with a lot of the things that I did. And I was expressing myself. And I really didn't think of the line too much between women and men, other than the more obvious parts, body parts, bathrooms, and so forth. But she saw me as encroaching um, on being not a man, but more like a woman. And maybe certain people in the audience would say that that's being more feminine or whatever. And so then I went out on this whole. After she said this had an impact on me, that she told me that I wasn't acting, I was acting like a woman, and I shouldn't act like a woman because I'm not a woman. I didn't understand how to unpack it. What about me was coming off as womanly? And so I struggled with that for several years, and it would come up again and again. I would, I mean, there's things that I do. I'd like to, um, I used to really like women's fabrics, and I would wear them, especially to sleep, um, just because I found them most comfortable. And I found them most fitting for something like sleep. And I found the idea of the Sleeping Beauty to be a beautiful idea. I found lots of things appealing that certain people would classify as women. So I struggle and try to correct my identity and become more masculine. I even try to deepen my voice and be the stronger person, and all these different ideas that I had of these identities. When what existed in me was expressions that can't be categorized nicely. And so what exists in me is the feminine and the masculine. What exists in me is the overlap between man and woman is always greater than the difference. So, of course, so when we identify ourselves, especially against something else, so I'm a woman, not a man, we are um, not only lying to ourselves, we are putting a constraint on ourselves that is going to be contradicted, going to cause problems, and going to cause us misery trying to keep it up. And so you might say, well, that I'm not so strict about what it means to be a woman, but I am a woman. And I'll give you the very basic fact that you are, that you might have certain types of physical differences, um, but that even hormonally, some people have the hormonal argument, but unfortunately, there's still more overlap than difference in hormonal activations um, between men and women. So you can find a man who is hormonally more active than some women, percentage of women. And so, why do we want to distinguish ourselves in distinct ways where the boundaries are clear? And the reason we want to do that is we want a kind of ground to stand on. We want to be able to say, clearly, I am this, and this is what you can expect of me, but it's also about our own security, our own insecurity around the fact that we are actually living in a very ambiguous world. And we, in fact, just our very being is extremely ambiguous. In fact, most people don't know 1% of themselves. And especially if they're identified even more, it means that they're way more likely to be making mistakes because they're drawing hard boundaries when their being exists in this kind of boundless way. So why shouldn't you identify? Well, it's very clear, because you don't know what you are. And as hard as it is, as hard as I believe it is for some people to be honest about that, that's actually the situation all the time. you try to go on a diet and you're like, okay, I can do that. I'm the person to go on the diet. And you go on the diet and somehow it doesn't turn out the way you think. You're not the person that you thought you were. And so that's a big point to point out, is that it's actually our identities are a collection of thoughts, feelings, sensations, formations. But at the most basic, we can just say that our identities are a collection of thoughts and sensations. And we can turn those up, or we can go a higher level abstraction and we can say, well, some of those thoughts and feelings put together are narratives. And so you say, well, I'm a male, or you say I'm a male, so I'm going to run the household, or be the stronger person. All while, if you hold yourself to that expectation, let's say, without realizing what you actually are, without being actually intimately aware of yourself, then you're likely going to be the person that puts 1,000 pounds on their back, and when no one is looking, crying, and basically in a situation where you feel you cannot even take off your load. Because if you do, you'll be contradicting your identity. So the idea is that we don't need to loosen up identities. Well, let's loosen them up. It's that we don't have to identify at all. And it's perfectly okay to tell people that the answer to their question, is that you don't know. And someone has asked me before, what race are you? Or what races are you? And my answer is, I'm pretty sure my father, biological father, would have identified as some sort of African or Caribbean American. And my mother, either that or Indian, to whatever degree. But I myself don't actually identify as any specific race. And you might say, well, that ignores the fact that other people will see. And this is a strange argument. We don't know that it's strange, but it's actually a really strange argument. The argument is, well, if there is a consensus about who I am that is outside of me, then I should believe that to be the truth. So it's like if someone, so that's the difficulty. And if someone says, and people have asked me my sexuality, and I used to have a huge problem with this. I used to think to myself, when is this going to come up? And then I felt, as I worked through it, experimented with it with people, going back and forth, and looking in myself and saying, what am I? Who am I? I don't dislike anyone. And like some of my closest male friends, let's say, could have been my life partners, in the way that we shared compassion and a love for each other. And so I cannot say that I am heterosexual, because that claims to know too much about myself. Do you get what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is, you may feel clear in your thoughts, but as I believe it was either Ramakrishna said, distinction or difference is only in form and ideas, form and thought. Actually. So distinction or difference is only in form and thought. And so when someone says I'm a Democrat, they may be just electing what they elected on, or what they selected on a form, which is okay, but usually they mean something more ambiguous that they believe is clear, and they think you should believe is clear. But if you actually look at their lives, they're going to have Democrat and Republican actions in them. Not saying that Democrat and Republican is clear, but if people voted on the types of things Republicans would like and the types of things Democrats would like, and then categorize someone by looking at their life, they wouldn't come out clearly Republican or clearly Democrat. And so it is only in this conceptual world of the mind making clear objects that are not a map to the world, or not a perfect mapping to the territory, and sometimes, or I'd say probably a lot of times, are distorted concepts about the world that give us something, some sort of security, some sort of certainty that the world is not what we're terrified. What we, I guess what I'm saying is that underlying this, the fact that this person is neither Democrat or Republican, and that they actually feel 100% sure that they are one of those, and then after that, they are unquestioning that that could ever change, is to negate the actual laws of reality, impermanent, transitioning, dissolving, rising and falling. And because of that, because of the fact that our reality is conditioned, this part of it, then we should know that the ground is, in fact, always shifting. And that what we find difficult to accept about that is that how can we actually have a livelihood or a life worth living if, in fact, all of the structure that we thought was here, all of this foundational, this groundedness that we got from all of these identities, why would we go and try to even find the truth of the matter, even if we can accept that actually all identities are false and bring about some misery? We seem to be holding the assumption that if you actually calculated the damage that would be done from identifying with these small identities compared to what it would be like to live in the actual ambiguity of the world, that living in the ambiguity of the world is several magnitudes higher. So we kind of accept this as a kind of subconscious assumption. Well, the reality is that the only game in town is groundlessness. And the only way out of that we suffer because things are groundless, because then we crave and desire stability in our identities and lots of things, but for this talk, identities. The only way we can move forward, it's almost like there's two stages. So you can accept the pleasure of an apple or chocolate or popcorn, ice cream, whatever it is, now, knowing that there's a delusion to the ice cream, let's say, meaning it's telling you nutritionally that it is actually amazing for you and it's exactly what you need, when in reality it's a hedonic response, right? That can lead to several adverse health outcomes. And what's happening is we're saying we're willing to trade that to keep those pleasures. And so at this level of reality that we're living, we're actually trading our lives for a very, very cheap set of pleasures. When you look inwards and you just come back to the clarity of awareness, like you go inside and you meditate. So you begin to realize that the thoughts, the feelings, sensations, formations, perceptions, all those things are entering into the consciousness, and that they are not particularly owned by anyone. They're not yours, per se. And that there's a bunch of generated things happening that are creating this sense of self. In Buddhism, it's called the five skandhas. And yet, what is aware of all of that? Why can we view the illusion as an illusion? How come we weren't designed in a way to prevent us from seeing that all of our identifications in this and so forth are actually elusive and not matching to reality? Why do we have access to that? And it seems to me that it's a beautiful thing that we do have access, because what it has enabled us, at least what we look at historically, is that it's enabled people to transcend this basic pleasure-pain scenario, this scenario of going towards pleasure, going towards security, pretending there's ground, watching it crack, suffering, and then trying to tape it all up again. So that life of chasing the ground and pretending things are secure, identifying and saying the world is very clear to me, look at these, and then something happens, an anomaly as we see it, and then we have to try to put the picture back together, and then we do this for our whole lives. And it appears, because we have the ability to become aware of the whole thing intimately, we actually have the ability to transcend it. And when we go into this space, now there's some Hindu religions that claim that there's an Atma, meaning that the identities I was talking about is a small version of self, and it's a fake, false version of self, and that there is actually a permanent self. And for some people, that's really hard to accept. And even if you just switch to Buddhism and some non-dual traditions, even from the Hindu tradition, there isn't an idea of an Atma or self. In fact, the anatta in Buddhism is about no self, there being no self. In Christian mysticism, you have this something called The Cloud of Unknowing, which was a book written by an anonymous author, but you have in that story, as well as Saint Teresa of Avila and Saint John of the Cross, the Dark Night of the Soul. You have all of these traditions that show that there is this way to connect with this oneness. And I know it probably sounds very New Age, but make it very basic. It means that this awareness of consciousness, when we abide in that, somehow we end up in a very blissful state. It's very strange that it's blissful. And maybe I don't understand it well enough to understand why it would be blissful, but when we abide in that space, and that's why when people are meditating, they can reach these states of samadhi, because they are actually becoming aware of the consciousness, of their consciousness, and then seeing that actually the question of who am I ends up being everything and nothing, this idea of and emptiness. And that's actually attainable through practice. And so what it means is that if you want to hold on to your small identities, if you're very sure that you have to correct the world of all of its issues with your small identity, like I'll change the world for all the people that are minorities, so let's say, or change the world for all of them, you're going to be stuck in that world forever, unfortunately. Because the reason for that is because ultimately, in order to liberate yourself from suffering, which is really what you want to do, and you want to also help others. But let's also be very clear that a lot of us, we want to help ourselves. And there are people who claim they want to help others and get really fired up over these social justice movements. And they totally miss the point of getting rid of people's suffering. So you can take, let's say, like I live in a monastery, let's say you take people here and you take their income and you say these people need to have basic income. Or you say these people need to be given jobs because all of the people in power, the elites, are keeping their jobs. A lot of them wouldn't go because they have understood or started to understand something that almost all of the traditions, secular and non-secular traditions, have pointed towards, that actually the key to life is not to play the game of put the pieces together, act like the world is secure, and then watch something break and put it together, and then go through that for your whole life. There has to be a way in which we can live outside of that. That we can live in a way where suffering isn't something we're always running from, where we don't need security, where we can find home wherever we are. So it's not the fact that I need to find home in my Vietnamese community because I'm Vietnamese and I grew up Vietnamese, and so then I need to be here with the Vietnamese, and now I feel at home. But then even within that community, you have people who claim that you're not as Vietnamese as you should be. And even then, those are individual people, and the fact that you find that special is a delusion. Unfortunately, it's a delusion. The delusion of community is still a delusion. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have community. It means that if you actually see that it has some essential quality that you cannot get anywhere else, you're completely fooled, and you're not able to bring it for yourself, to abide in your awareness, to develop it's not even develop, it's to discover that home is wherever you are. And so you don't feel out of place if you're at a community. I go to Shabbat on Friday, and that's a community I go to, but I don't identify as Jewish. I live in a Zen monastery. I don't identify as Buddhist. I read the Gita, I practice Krishna consciousness with a group. I don't identify as a devotee. There's no need. There's no need to find security in that, because I'm beginning to see that there is basic goodness in a way, the way Chongyam Trungpa put it, there's basic goodness that is within us and that we always have access to. And so to outsource my happiness, to outsource my home to fictional realities that will eventually dry up is not what I'm in the business of doing. And I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else. So It's not that you need to drop your identities, it's that you need to see why those identities exist. And you could almost say that anyone who doesn't identify in a free way, that doesn't mean they're awakened, but you can almost be sure that every awakened being, everyone who realizes the way and realizes themselves, is not identified. And that's not a coincidence. So really think about that. Really think about where you're getting your contentedness from and why you can't really be with yourself. Maybe look into that. Can I be with myself? And it's not about you need to be alone in the mountains as a monk or anything like that. You can do it in the middle of a community. You can do it while also still identifying as an Indian person, Indian female person. That's my thing. So let's sit with that. Thank you.
Imagine a life without division. Without division. Without division. Without division.